All right, it's 11 o'clock, so we'll get started. Welcome, everyone. Before we get into the presentation, I'm going to throw out a couple questions to set the context for this discussion. So first question, who knows anyone who's ever participated in a clinical trial? Raise your hand. Ah, wow, great number, great percentage for this population relative to the true percentages in the world. Who feels like they know what clinical trials are well enough to understand what they're intended to accomplish? Okay, good. A little bit more, almost, but a good percentage of the group. So what we're here to talk to you about today is a use case for Tableau on the clinical trial data and how impactful that has been to Takeda. So I am Krista McKee. I'm the head of Insights and Analytics in Takeda's Data Sciences Institute. That is a group within our research and development function within Takeda. My colleague Raveen here will introduce himself in a second. So just a couple obligatory slides on Takeda before we get started. So Takeda is a very large biopharmaceutical company that really aims to bring better health and a brighter future to patients around the world. And we do that not, for every disease that exists. We do that for, really the diseases in which we focus, or the disease areas in which we explicitly focus and really ensure that we have a lot of expertise. And we're not looking for just incremental improvements. We are really looking to be innovative and really looking to bring life-changing treatments to patients. Takeda has a very global presence. It has a Japanese heritage, and it started over 230 years ago. So we're the oldest Japanese pharmaceutical company, but now a very global company that has a presence in over 80 countries. And because of our Japanese heritage and now our global presence, we are listed on both the New York and the Tokyo Stock Exchanges. And so we started here in 1781, a long time ago, with our founder, Chibai Takeda, selling at that time traditional herbal medicines in Japan. But his business model has sustained itself with a focus on integrity and values and quality of product. And that's something that has been in Takeda's history all the way through. And it's a nice heritage that we can subscribe to and build on as we work to bring medicines to people around the world.
Thank you, Krista. My name's Raveen Sharma, and I'm with Deloitte Consulting. And I'm not an accountant. Most people ask me if I'm an accountant, which is nothing wrong with that. My part of Deloitte, what we do is we focus on the life sciences industry. We focus on pharma. And we combine special elements. We combine elements of cloud engineering, information management, data sciences, informatics, and we essentially build cloud analytics systems capabilities for our clients, Takeda being one of them. What we want to cover today is kind of the transformation that Takeda has undergone with data and analytics. And to kind of tee it up, what I want to talk about first is some of the challenges and opportunities in R&D. Some of this based on the survey Krista did, some of this will be old hat to you, some of it will be new to you, but I think looking at it through this lens kind of structures the rest of the conversation. Then we'll get into how Takeda started to address that and made strides towards trying to achieve and capture those opportunities by building out a foundational system called the Data Hub. It's actually a cloud-based data and analytics hub, which is then used as the foundational accelerator for a number of really special use cases. And that's where Krista will come back and talk about Project Platypus. And it has an interesting legacy and an interesting way it was named. So that'll be a lot of fun. And then really to round out the presentation, talk about what impact that has had on the organization. And also, where is this going? Where is it trending? Where do we want to go in the future? So I love visualizations. It's a passion. I worked for a visualization startup years ago, not Tableau, somebody else. But this visualization makes me a little bit sad. And really what it's showing is the return on investment, which you can say is really the R&D productivity of a group of pharma companies, I think a cohort of about 15 or so companies that we've tracked over the past decade. And really it's showing a grim picture, right? The return on investment or the productivity has been steadily declining over the past decade, and it's reached an all-time low. So that's one thing to put in our hats. Secondly, the cost to bring a drug to market or bring an asset through the pipeline has pretty much doubled. So you can see down in the bottom left, bottom right, it went from about $1 billion to about $2 billion. And that figure sounds like a huge amount. It is a huge amount. And a number of industry sources have kind of corroborated, and they all agree it's about $2 billion to bring a drug to market. So the kick in the pants really is when you bring a drug to market, your projected peak sales, which is how much money you think you can obtain at its peak, has kind of gone down by half. So your productivity has been declining. It's at an all-time low. It costs $2 billion to put something through the pipeline, get it onto the market. And when you do finally get it onto the market, you're getting less money than in the past. So, you know, the industry, there is a driving need because it is healthcare. It is trying to help patients. So, you know, no, we're not giving up. As an industry, we're not giving up. So being analytical about it, what we want to do is break it down. So what's behind what determines those numbers? So you can think of this as a representative formula. So return on investment, think of it as productivity. And really this formula can be applied to any industry, really. So you've got value creation, which is your numerator, and you've got efficiency, or how efficient do you do your work, as the denominator. And things such as, you know, throughput of molecules, the success rate or the probability of success, if you're in the industry, and the value that you bring. Are you a Me Too therapy, or are you addressing a unique unmet need within the patient population? That's representative of value. So that's kind of the numerator. And then doing things more efficiently. Can you reduce cost? Can you reduce cycle time, which means you're doing activities more efficiently? And so if you kind of work on both at the same time, then you have a chance of increasing productivity. And, you know, hopefully we've bottomed out and we're turning this around. So what you can appreciate is data and analytics plays a role all over the place. It's involved in the numerator and it's involved in the denominator. So, you know, what is the process that we're trying to improve or trying to be more productive about? So I know a lot of you are in pharma, some of you are not, but I think it's worth going through this. And so really this is a very simplistic, representative, abstract view of the drug development and drug discovery process. So starting with drug discovery, you have research teams that use their knowledge of chemistry, biology, genomics, population health to identify a lead compound or a lead molecule or a lead idea for a therapy that they think's got potential, it's got the right characteristics in the lab, and they want to take it to the next step. So they go to the next step, and they employ a series of mice, rats, and other higher order organisms to test out their hypothesis, right? That's the preclinical stage. And if enough of those mice survive, they're like, okay, we're ready to try it out in humans. And so you enter phase 1 or first in man, first in human clinical trials where you try and see, okay, is this compound, is it tolerable by the population that I've recruited? And if it is, you slowly increase dose, and then you get into phase 2 where you're trying to understand, is there an actual effect, an efficacious effect? And then you cap it all off, if all things go well, you cap it off with a phase 3 trial, a pivotal trial, where you test a broader population. You make sure you have the right power, the right number of patients involved. And if that makes it through, then you're able to submit your results, submit your package to the FDA or other regulators around the world to seek approval to then be able to put the drug on market and you know, recoup your investment or start recouping your investment. So a couple points of context from the very beginning to the end, on average, it's about 12 to 15 years. Okay, so it's a long, involved, arduous, complex process. Being in Vegas, you can say, what are the odds of actually making it through? So in the preclinical phase, where you see that picture of a mouse, going from there to approval, on average, again, because it varies, you're looking at 1 in 100 chance. Okay, so you can see that this is really complex stuff. And to sum this up, actually, there's a great quote that came out in Forbes magazine earlier this year, and it says, "What's often lost on people is how incredible it is that we find any medicines at all." And the person who said that was the CEO of Novartis, second largest pharmaceutical company in the world. And he's by no means unique. Others at his level who run these organizations say, yeah, it's really tough. It's really hard. So that's kind of the scene. We're not solving simple problems or trying to achieve simple problems, but the payoff and the impact on society is huge. So data and analytics. So, it's disrupting every industry. It's disrupting R&D in pharma. And what's happened in the past is that the traditional kind of rigid, inflexible systems to capturing and managing data, they're just not up to the task. Okay? What we're harnessing at present are new techniques, new analytical techniques, new ways of employing those analytical techniques in the cloud so that we can actually process and use and gain insights from the new kinds of data that are coming available. And this is setting us up for the future where once we've gathered that data, we've applied processes to it, it's somewhat clean, we can then attempt to apply machine learning, advanced analytics, and artificial intelligence even to try and derive further insights. So really a digital analytics and data-driven transformation is happening all over the industry. And in the spirit of the productivity equation, value creation divided by cycle time or efficiency, what's happening is project teams in pharma, they have to deal with more drugs in the pipeline, so more studies and trials. And those trials are becoming more complex. They're becoming more intricate. So finding those patients is becoming harder and harder. But really, the opportunity is to kind of focus on the patient. Focus on collecting information and data about the patients, their relationship with their diseases, usually it's plural, and then the relationship with the drug or the therapies that they've tried before. So understanding every shred of detail around how that works, that's really the opportunity, because that'll lead us to be able to do better targeted patient recruitment, so being able to recruit patients to trials faster, so reducing cycle time, making sure those trials are properly overseen, so again, making it more efficient, and then being able to apply techniques such as machine learning, advanced analytics, to perhaps tweak the value curve so that you're improving value. So that's really the opportunity that could hopefully turn that productivity curve back around, and then in a few years we'll have a big smile on that curve, right? So, that's a pretty big ask. It's a tall order. So Takeda had a good vision in this area, and what they wanted to do is establish a data hub, right? Bring all this data together, and let's make it available. Let's break down silos. Let's make it efficient. And so the vision that was established was to say, okay, all R&D data is in scope for this system. So we're not leaving any function, we're not leaving any domain of data behind. And let's communicate that out to the organization. So we're going to be after any and all data in R&D. The other aspect to this is you got to be pretty quick about it, because the researchers, the business side, they don't have patience for these grand visions that are going to boil the ocean. They're like, okay, I have certain problems. They're acute. They're urgent. I need them solved. If you're not going to solve them for me, I'm going to go off and figure out how to do it myself and probably end up in another siloed system or another siloed set of software. So being quick, so essentially as fast as possible using a simplified architecture, which the cloud lends itself to, and also being agile about it. So agile, using that kind of repetitive sprint-based format, is a mindset that had to be applied here. And then in order to move quickly, you also have to kind of look ahead and see where the speed bumps are that may slow you down. So, looking ahead, and again, this may not be unique to pharma, but data governance, okay? You got to make sure that you're using the right data, right? So data governance comes into play. And cloud skills and machine learning skills and other skills that are not the traditional ones that you already have a lot of. Those are the kind of new things you need to be ahead of. Either you develop your own or you do develop your own, but in the meantime, you have to backfill. So you might rent those skill sets. Then unique to pharma is this concept of GXP validation. So if I'm going to be looking at patient data, clinical data, making decisions off of that, it needs to be regulated. You need to comply to those regulations for auditability and traceability. And then security, information security, that's pretty common. And so, again, those are the guiding principles. So how did we actually achieve and go after this? And so really, this was not a technology project. This is not an IT project. This is a business-led, business-driven project. So there's a lot here, but focus in on the nice, pretty bubble chart in the middle, because I like visualizations. So what you see there is the y-axis is urgency. How dire is the need? How acute is the business need? Or how critical is the business problem? And then the x-axis is a measure of, it says difficulty, but it's a measure of feasibility, right? Am I going to try and solve a problem that has never been done before? So that's pretty tough. So I want to put things in certain buckets. And then the size of the bubble, the size of the circle, is really what is the impact, or potential impact to Takeda, right? And again, taking that lens of the R&D productivity formula, so is it an activity that is going to improve or increase value? Or is it an activity that's going to increase my efficiency, reduce cycle time? So using that lens, we came up with a scoring mechanism. And this is representative because there were hundreds of different use cases. There's a lot of need in the research community in pharma. And so the biggest, boldest circle there is something that Krista is going to talk about in the deep dive into that project. And it's pretty incredible. So in terms of the architecture, so again, you have a business problem. You've prioritized it. You said, okay, I'm going to go for it. And so what we did is we brought in the appropriate data source, or data sources for that problem. So we're being kind of focused on that business problem. We're not trying to boil the ocean and suck in all data from all systems, right? We're trying to approach it in a pragmatic way. So that gets ingested or pulled in, and that could be external data, or it could be internal data, so from internal systems within the organization. And then it goes through a number of processing steps, which if you're in technology, you're probably familiar with. You ingest it, you land it, you process it, you check for data quality, you might enrich it with some algorithms, and then you make it ready for consumption. A consumption endpoint could be another system, or predominantly what we've seen is that interactive, high-quality, domain-specific visualizations is what rules the day for a lot of the use cases. And in case you're wondering, that's where Tableau comes in. Back to the patient data, I just want to provide a little more context. So think about your body. Think about if you're a patient. So you visit a doctor. All sorts of lab tests might be done on you. Information is collected about your environmental factors, where you live, how much activity you do, so that's all collected. If you're on a clinical trial, an extensive set of information is collected. So clinical trial data typically is not what you would consider big data. It's smaller data, but it's got hundreds, if not thousands, of fields. So it's very, very wide, very rich. So you combine that with big data, such as your genomics and omics data, and then your demographic data, and what's coming out more and more and more, as you all know, those of you who have Fitbits and the new monitors, there's a lot of digital data that's becoming available. That's the new kind of data that you want to be able to interpret as well, because that could add another dimension to your analysis. So really, patient data, it is big when you amass all of it. It's complex, it's growing rapidly, it's multidimensional, and really what the researchers and scientists needed was a way to gain the context, understand the data, drill into features so they can generate those insights that are necessary to make decisions on clinical trials, to make decisions about progressing or not progressing a molecule through the pipeline. And so, there's a lot of beautiful visualizations that have been created. This is just a sampling of them. And what I'd like to do is turn it over back to Krista, and she'll walk us through Project Platypus.
Great, thank you, Raveen. So Project Platypus. Really has been an exciting project to work on, and we'll go through the details now. So Platypus, it's an innovative GXP-validated clinical trial data review tool, and Raveen gave the background on the GXP validation, effectively to make a decision in a very regulated space based on a visualization tool we need to abide by these GXP validation rules. And it was actually a big deal for Takeda to get there on a set of visualizations. And so I'll get to that in a little more detail. Platypus has been recognized externally in major ways. So in 2018, it got a Best Practices Award by BioIT World. This year, we've been nominated as a finalist for I4 Pharma Awards in the Best Data and Analytics Initiative across pharma, which is a pretty big recognition. The competition's pretty steep, so I'm keeping my fingers crossed. We'll know about in a month whether or not we actually win. But it's a tool that's delivering results across Takeda. We have effectively scaled this for this specific use case across a very large company, which again has been a real accomplishment and quite a pleasure to navigate. So the biggest question I get is, why is it called platypus? And so here is why. A platypus is a strange animal, but a unique and what I think is quite a lovable way. It swims through the vast muddy waters, so it's a mammal that swims. The waters are very muddy. It can't see, it can't hear, it can't smell, but it can effectively find the food it needs to sustain itself. And the way it finds that food is with a very powerful form of electroreception that is actually very unique for a mammal to have. Takeda's platypus, in parallel to that, swims through the vast amount of clinical data. And the data are vast. In these studies, as Raveen was pointing out, you can have hundreds of patients. And in vaccines, which Takeda also has an arm that focuses on vaccines, you can have up to 20,000 subjects. So there are a lot of data being collected in the context of clinical trials. What needs to be looked at in the context of an ongoing trial is what we are considering the food here. That is the important stuff, the things that we need to be able to identify and then make decisions on through the course of an ongoing trial. So Takeda's platypus gives it the powerful ability to find the food within the mud of the clinical data. The food being what's important, the mud being everything else that's there and important, but not so important that you need to immediately react upon it. And I'll talk through this in a little more detail as we go through. And so you'll see this slide a few times, again, just back to our overview, just pointing out that now we're focusing really solely in on here, on the clinical study data. And again, for any given compound, they have multiple phases. There's never just one trial before a drug gets to the market. There are often at least a few, mostly many, many more than a few, just to get one drug to the market. And so when we run our clinical trials, Takeda is the sponsor, and as a sponsor, we take on certain obligations. And these are actually mandated to us by the regulatory authorities. And so as a global company, we deal with a lot of regulatory authorities. This one, the FDA, is obviously a very important one to us and a leading regulatory authority for us. So this is just a summary of the things we're accountable for as we run clinical trials. So we must select qualified investigators, right? So you don't want, you don't want a yoga teacher giving you drugs on a clinical study, right? You need to have a qualified medical doctor who is actually trained in clinical trials. You have to ensure proper monitoring of the investigation throughout the course of the entire investigation. You have to ensure that it's properly documented and approved, and if it's changing over time, you can't just change it here and there. You have to prospectively define everything you're going to do in a clinical trial, and if there are modifications, you have to submit them and get them approved before you can even put those into play. And then you have to ensure that patients are at the center here, which is, again, core to what Takeda does. But also mandated on us as a sponsor of clinical trials, we have to make sure we have that data at our fingertips and we can interpret it in a manner that allows us to identify risk, right? So if we go into clinical trial and we start to see signals that say, we're seeing different things here than we saw in the earlier trials or in the preclinical space, we got to stop and evaluate it and make sure we can go on, right? Because the last thing we want to do is be pushing forward drugs that are ultimately not safe for our patients. So Platypus, this is Platypus. It's really a suite of Tableau visualizations on the clinical study data. Platypus has a couple articulations. This articulation is at the study level. So what you see here is one study worth of data across over 20 visualizations. And they're all pretty complex, you can see, and you can see the domains there. So again, as Raveen pulled up on his chart, there's medical history, there's prior therapies, there's efficacy data, there's exposure data, there's adverse events, there's labs, it goes on and on. A lot of data that we need to make sure that we have a pulse on throughout the course of a trial. This is not analysis. This is different from the statistical analysis that happens at the end of the study. And in fact, it has to be, right? You can't analyze the data as you go through a study. That you have to define that prospectively and do it most likely only at the end. Sometimes you do it in the middle, but that's always defined up front. So no analysis here, but just views on the data in which you can easily see the picture and make important interpretations. And the reviewers here are medical reviewers. They are trained medical doctors who are charged with, again, that sponsor obligation of making sure they have a pulse on the clinical data as it's collecting over time. Tableau has been huge for us here. And a funny story, actually the precursor of Platypus was a set of inadequate and poorly designed and poorly evolved Spotfire visualizations. And when years ago when I started on this project, we were going through our diligence of figuring out how that tool was working and just all the details around it. So I had a pretty heavy engagement with our Spotfire rep. At one point he finds out, and I tell him, I said, we've done an analysis, we're moving to another solution. Thank you for your time, we'll be in touch. I leave on vacation, and he had, as sort of a last-ditch effort, kind of said, I hear you're using Tableau, and I tell him I cannot tell a lie. That's what you're hearing, it's true. And so I go on vacation, I come back to a pile of letters on my desk where he had wrote to every vice president that he could find in the organization that says why Spotfire is better than Tableau. Little did he know that all of those would just land on my desk and we would just carry on with our project and I would just never return his call again. But Tableau has been important because it's been helpful for us to be able to deliver this to a population that isn't the most data literate. They're data literate from the fact that they have to understand the data when presented to them, but they can't go searching within the data themselves. They are not that skilled in that in that skill. So we needed to give them something that's intuitive, something they could see and interpret without getting lost. And so these are all highly customized, also highly templated, because when you think across a clinical trial, adverse event data on one trial kind of looks the same as it does on another trial, and it actually has to, based upon some of the standardization that has been put upon the industry by the regulators, the FDA specifically. And so with a lot of thought and engagement with the business, we were able to get to a very good series of visualizations that answered all their questions, but was also very scalable across the organization. And so, again, lots of data there intended for the medical reviewers. These are by no means all the questions. And in fact, when we went through the design process here, we articulated 63 questions that these medical reviewers needed to routinely ask across studies that informed how we actually designed Platypus. And so this is just to give you an example of some of the questions that the medical reviewers ask on the data. And so the first one is, are the right patients in the study? And it seems like a pretty obvious question, but when you think about it in the context of that drug that's actually to the market, so any drug you take, whether it's aspirin or any more elaborate drug, when you look at it, there's a label there, right? And the label tells you what dose to take, who it's intended for, what the side effects are, and so on and so on. And really everything we do in the drug development process ultimately informs what that label says on our drug. And a requirement to get a drug approved is when we go to those regulatory authorities with our submission package saying, here, we think we have a drug, will you approve it effectively? That's what we ask. We don't say here's a drug in general, we say we have a drug for this specific patient population, right? And that's a key element in the whole drug development process. So it's an obligation of ours to make sure as we're testing the drug, we're actually testing it in the relevant populations that we ultimately intend to get approval in. And really those populations are defined based upon based upon what the science tells us, what populations are most likely to respond to this particular drug based upon the science. So are the right patients in the study? So we have a set of stratification factors, or really just distributions that we track throughout the course of the study. And the architecture that Raveen spoke to was important here, because the old way here was, with some exception, was to really not look at data as actively as Platypus is allowing us to do. We would certainly look at it, but look at it in sort of less systemic ways. There were some sort of people who did this for a long time who would know to ask for it frequently, but across Takeda there were groups where they didn't know that they should be reviewing the data so actively, and so they would get it maybe one time in the middle of this trial and one time at the end of the trial and try to make sense of it there. So with the architecture, we run the data through in an automated fashion so that this is refreshing on a monthly basis now across all our studies in Platypus, which is now across all our therapeutic areas. It's still growing. It's in about 60 studies to date. We have more than that are active, but we have a factory model that's actively pushing these out. But these are for a study, just what are seen as those important distributions to understand what our patients are like, and are they the patients that we intended to treat in this trial when we defined it prospectively. This question can get a little more specific, right? So it's not only what patients in regard to what disease they have or what specific history they have, it's also in response in what line of therapy, right? So if you look at labels, sort of for a lot of drugs, it's not just essentially a patient gets a disease, first drug there that is treated for that disease is their first line of therapy. Second, third, and fourth follows. Cancer is a good example of that because lines of therapy in that disease matter a lot, right? Resistance mutations typically always come in cancer, and so patients get diagnosed with the disease, they're treated with that first line therapy. Ultimately, there's a progression and they have to go on to different medications. And so if we say that we're coming in as a first-line therapy, we need to make sure that we're only treating patients who are newly diagnosed with that disease that we're looking at. This particular visualization shows that it's clear that we're looking at a second-line therapy drug, right? So everyone's got a first line. The green means, well, not everyone, a large portion of the population have a first-line therapy. But when you engage with regulatory therapies, particularly, regulatory agencies, in this case, the FDA said, okay, you're saying it's a second-line therapy, but make sure it's a real second-line therapy in the US. Meaning if you have a bunch of patients from another country whose first-line therapy is completely different than what you see in the US, we're not going to care about those patients. We're not going to care about them large. We're not going to count them. So you better make sure that your population is representative of who would ultimately get the drugs in the US. And so this little tree map on the right here tells us that. So it tells the distributions of that first-line therapy to say, for the medical reviewer with their knowledge to go in and say, is this relevant to the US, yes or no? In this case, it was, and so we're looking good, right? A large portion of the population is getting second-line therapy after a first line that is representative of what's the treatment paradigm in the US. But then again, I said we're applying for second-line therapy, but we got a lot of patients here who have had more than one prior therapy. That's a big red flag because, again, ultimately, when this comes to analysis, if we're surprised by this at the end of the study, these patients need to be excluded from the analysis, which is a big loss for us. I mean, particularly in oncology, every single patient can cost on the order of $200,000. There's a range, but that's a safe number to throw out, that it is possible that trials have are so big and so complex out of necessity to prove what they need to, that the cost of one individual patient is quite expensive. And so if you think about even 5 patients who are sneaking in who ultimately need to get thrown out at the end, that's $1 million that we've just effectively wasted, right? And so this is an important thing for us to monitor and look at more deeply. And again, it requires medical expertise. I, as a non-medical person, couldn't go in there and make an assessment, but the medical reviewer can see this and see that, okay, in this top circle here, there is not progression. And so again, in oncology, where lines of therapies are important, where the drugs are often very toxic, it can happen that a patient gets the drug and their adverse events are so bad they have to get pulled off the drug. They are, in those circumstances, not on a drug for long enough to even know if it was effective or not. So we can't count it as a line of therapy. And so those patients can be presumed as coming off their prior therapy for probably toxicity reasons, and therefore they're okay. But there's a cohort here, and again, it's several patients, at least on this visualization, where they need to ask the question, what's going on here? And so important questions to make sure we're paying attention to and enabling the drugs are getting to the market as we intend them to. What about safety? I think this one's an obvious one. So, and really an obligation for us as a sponsor, and really, Takeda's value of being patients at the center, we have to be all over this, right? We want to make sure we're giving patients safe drugs. All drugs have toxicities, but most toxicities can be effectively managed, but you can't effectively manage if you don't identify them proactively and define what that management looks like. And so, adverse events become important to track. And again, this is across the study, updated on a monthly basis, a nice, easy visualization on adverse events that are being reported on the trials. And some of these adverse events are just related to the disease. There's fatigue, there's nausea, there's headaches that, if you have a disease, can be just part of the disease. Some are due to the drug. And so over time, we have to be able to tease out that picture. What's due to the disease, what's due to the drug, what's reportable, what's not, and so on. And this is just a masterful view relevant to what existed in the past to give these medical reviewers, one glance and the information they need to pursue from there. Same thing for labs. There's a lot of blood draws taken. And this is a good example of the food in the mud. So if you look, there are 2 reference lines here, and they're pretty close together in both of them. And so you can look, essentially, there's a lot of activity between those reference lines. But that's the mud here, because really those are the normal ranges. You want everyone, if we all took a blood draw today, most of us would have all our lab samples come back in these normal ranges. It's the ones that don't, these peaks and these spikes, that become important food for a medical reviewer to understand. And again, I can't tell you how many hours and days it used to take for people to do this and understand it across a given trial. Seconds, and they can go into it, pick their analyte of choice, and have a look. And you really, when you think about labs, one of the primary things you're looking at is liver toxicity, and so the analytes that are relevant to the liver are probably the most viewed graphs here. Same thing for vital signs, the same point, again, just looking for those outliers, which is our food. Same thing for EKGs, or really any sort of lab type evaluation we conduct in a trial. We have these templates that we can now easily roll out across all of our studies. And so we see a lab value, we see an outlier, and we say, okay, this looks concerning, I need more. And so what the medical reviewer can now do is go into a patient-level dashboard, which is really a comprehensive view of that patient's story on the trial. The x-axis is time, and the y-axis has all of the domains of data for that given patient stacked up over time. And a nice feature of Tableau that I really like is actually the keys on the side tell you a lot. So you can see there's a lot of color coding here. There's a lot of things that will draw the informed reviewer to the important food here. But also just how by design how Tableau works is, something for an adverse event. Severe adverse events are something those are food, right? Mild one might not be food, that might be mud. But you can see right on the side, just with the selectors and the key, if this patient has an adverse event just by the color coding there. You don't even have to scroll down, because this can get quite wide because patients can be on trials for years. But it's again, a huge progress for the organization. And in fact, Takeda was lacking a view like this prior to Platypus. What clinicians had to do prior to us building this tool was go across a massive spreadsheet with lots of different worksheets and really cut and paste for a different patient and manually pull together a spreadsheet, which is time consuming and also prone to a lot of human error, right? And so again, when you think about patients being at the center, us fulfilling our obligations, this is a necessity. We have to be able to see this, and we now do very, very clearly. So the impact of Platypus, again, not only helping us meet our obligations, not only helping patients stay at the center and in the forefront of our minds as we're treating them on clinical trials, but really what we have done with the automation of the data through these visualizations on such a frequent basis, we've really front-loaded the activity around the quality of the data, right? So you're seeing from the beginning what the data are looking like. And there are some pretty serious quality looks that are important. For instance, efficacy data, you can't analyze it, but it can be quite complex, right? And so you can and should look at it just from a quality perspective, just to make sure you're getting the MRIs on when they're expected to come, right? You're getting the biopsies when they're expected to come. Because again, if you run a trial to prove efficacy and you don't have efficacy data, you're throwing several $100,000 out the window for each given patient that hasn't collected it. And so by showing that very clearly month after month, what we have shown at Takeda is that this critical time from when you say, okay, we've defined a protocol, we've defined a study, this is what it looks like, we've collected all the data we need, it's time to go to analysis. We can pick up and move most quickly to analysis if we've used Platypus. Historically, there was always okay, we have everything we need, let's go, but then there becomes like a 6-week period where you're saying, uh-oh, data looks wrong here, data looks wrong here, and you're chasing and cleaning a lot. We've front-loaded that chasing and cleaning to happen throughout the course of a trial so that we can more seamlessly say, okay, we have all the data we need, now let's go through the multi-step process to get to that analysis and those top-line results, which will tell us whether or not we have a drug. So that was all about one study. And as I said before, any given program or any given therapy that ultimately gets to the market doesn't just have one clinical trial. It often has many, and often within many different indications. So they're not necessarily just one disease per drug. It can often be multiple diseases that can be treated by a particular drug. And so Platypus is also a suite of Tableau visualizations for clinical program data review. And this gets at sort of the bigger question around the patient safety and signal management across a compound. You can see there are much fewer visualizations here. When we think about the study level and all those visualizations, we were pulling in about 25 different domains of clinical trial data. Here we're pulling around 8. But the beauty of this is in the back-end architecture, we are automatically pooling that data over time to show this view on a monthly basis, which makes us industry leading in this place. From an old way of doing things, it's very hard, it's a very labor intensive step to pool data across lots of studies, even across only 8 domains. But it's necessary for what we call signal management. And the group that does signal matches is actually another group of doctors within Takeda that sits within another function called Global Patient Safety Evaluation, or pharmacovigilance is sort of the more generic term that people may be familiar with. So again, the domains of data are there. And so the use case here is how does the safety of this drug look across all my studies, right? Because it could be in one trial, the safety profile looks one way, in another one, it looks completely different, right? And it's important and actually an obligation of a sponsor to have a holistic view to make sure, again, we're not bringing things to the market that will ultimately cause harm to patients. And so, again, this is a similar view you've seen before, but the beauty of this one is that this has 10 studies in it. And you can see across all those 10 studies a very simple view of the safety of this compound. And the first, we call this Platypus P for program level. It's a little bit earlier in its scaling. We're in about 8 programs right now and working to really rapidly get that across all of our programs. The first user who helped us really design or implement, this was actually designed very thoughtfully by our statistics leaders and our GPSE group. What we were able to do in my group was just come and scale it effectively and then make some improvements on it. Because again, once you give a tool out there that's broadly used, not only are you elevating that baseline across the organization, but you're getting good input from all over the organization. So anytime we get a good idea, we don't just benefit that team that had the good idea, we bring it in and we apply it across all our visualizations. And so we are collectively improving the organization as a whole over time in a way that is just fundamentally a game changer for us in this space. And so the first user of Platypus P articulated that what used to take her 5 months now takes her 1 to 2 days. That's the type of dramatic change this is. And the 5 months before wasn't just okay, let me look at all the data for 5 months. It was based upon the lack of sort of a proactive delivery model for this data and the smart visualizations that were designed for these reviewers, but could also be engaging and interactive. What used to happen is that essentially they'd identify a question, right? And so that question identification was day 0. And from the time that question was identified, there'd be a series of meetings with the relevant people to say, okay, what data should we look like? How do we pull it together? What vendor do we need to, or vendors usually do we need to coordinate with to get this data in the format we need? And so there was a lot of wasted time between question presentation and actually answer, and we've completely eliminated that here. Or, I mean, it takes some time to kind of articulate the question and go through it still, but we've largely eliminated a lot of the noise there, which was historically significant. This is another view in Platypus P, which actually is more statistical in nature, and it clearly shows within any study that has 2 arms, whether certain events favor one arm versus the other. And there's a significance line that can be altered by the user to their level to say, okay, for any given clinical study, for the most part, there needs to be a comparator, right? Because when you're coming to the market with a new drug, there's often other drugs on the market, and you're saying, we think we have something better, but we have to prove it. And so not only do we have to prove more efficacious, but we have to prove more safety. And so this is, again, just a view that's at their fingertips now to say, okay, our compound versus compound X looks pretty good from a safety standpoint, but actually there's a couple things here that are favoring this arm. And in this case, it means if it's favoring the arm, it means these events at some significance level are showing up more prominently in one arm versus the other. And so that's an important question to be asking as we think about safety across a compound. So impact of Platypus at the program level. The patient trust, reputation, and business, those are Takeda's values that I sort of made reference to in the beginning, didn't call out specifically, but effectively you can see here, really the impact is enhanced patient safety, earlier detection, which again, as a sponsor in an organization, it's not only what we want to do, but it's what's best for our stakeholders. It helps our reputations because we're doing a better job at what we're supposed to be doing. And it's just improved efficiency. Again, if you think about that 5 months to 1 to 2 days, there were a lot of people involved in that 5-month scenario. And so we've effectively said, okay, you guys are still very important to the organization, but there's a lot of work to be done. And based on the statistics Raveen showed, we have to do more with less as an organization. So we have to find ways to eliminate some of the white space that is not necessarily bringing the value. So these important stakeholders we can be accomplishing more with less. So summary of lessons learned. So Platypus is Takeda's most successful project off the R&D Data Hub. And really, it's been an interesting education at a pharmaceutical company. For a long time, people thought the R&D Data Hub was Platypus, and Platypus was the R&D Data Hub. But really, again, it's an application. It's a set of Tableau visualizations that has used or taken advantage of the Data Hub ecosystem to make progress for Takeda. But I liked yesterday, I went to the Tableau blueprint session, and the speaker there was talking about how, how much change management there is in anything, in moving from Excel spreadsheets to Tableau. And I would say even for exceptional products, which Platypus is, there is no question about the value to the organization. There is no question. Every user who sits down and understands it is very excited about it and what it can do for them. That said, it's still a shift in just their day-to-day. They have to get used to looking at data a little bit differently. They have to get used to looking at data a little more comprehensively. One would argue they should have historically, but the tools were so limited that they just could not historically. And so the metrics around making sure you're not only putting things out there, but you're measuring it and supporting it is an important element of success here. And Platypus has been really a good example of that. The other analogy I like to make is if you think about the platypus, the unique animal it is, it lays eggs like a reptile, it has a beak like a bird, it swims like a fish, yet it's a mammal, right? So the concept of kind of functional silos is, not known to the platypus, right? It's all mingled in there together. And really when you think about R&D in the pharma industry, there are only a few types of data that are used, and that's not fair. There are a few types of data that are used very broadly, and a lot of functions depend upon it. And yet we've come from a place of huge functional silos that have prevented that. And so what we've done with this one tool in focusing so deeply on the data and all the questions surrounding it, focusing on making sure it gets to the right users, but also more people who might be able to appropriately benefit from it, it has led to this cross-functional engagement that is really where we want to be as an organization, that can drive to increase productivity, and that can also drive to reduce cycle times. And it's been nice to see. Again, it takes work to get there, but it's happening because of the power of Tableau and what we've built in these set of visualizations on the clinical data. And so lessons learned, just speaking to it, change management's important. It's important from the beginning. It will last a lot longer than you want it to. It takes a lot of effort. You shouldn't give up on it. And it even is a lot of work, even if you have the best messaging from on high, which I have the pleasure of having in this case, it's still getting the middle levels to make sure they can sort of adapt their ways of working to a new tool is an important consideration to identify and to be working cross-functionally to attend to over time. Speed rules, so speed matters, and this is sort of a lessons learned across all of our Data Hub projects, which often lend itself to some sort of Tableau visualization in a lot of cases. But it is important to really sit down with the business partner and make sure you're delivering something that's going to be valuable, because they will get excited by the shiny object for about a minute or so, but really you need to make sure it's something that they can go in and work with. And again, this is where Tableau has been fantastic for us, the intuitiveness of it and the fact that we are using it in multiple places, so there's some continuity there. People aren't having to retrain themselves all the time, has helped us here in making sure we're bringing the business value to them. Cloud platform, again, that's the enabler, that's the automation, that is a fundamental piece here, right? I do have a lot of people, because we do attend to all of R&D, we do have a lot of people just coming to us for basic operational dashboards, and when I ask them where the data are, they have no idea. It's in a spreadsheet here, spreadsheet there. And so really the talk yesterday at the keynote around data culture, it's something actually we've been talking about for the last couple of years, and how do we turn a sort of large pharmaceutical company, and really R&D is our focus, which is nice. We can kind of narrow in on a smaller section of it, but how do we establish this data culture enabled by a cloud platform to get people to understand what they need to be doing on the data collection standpoint or the source level to enable us to give them business intelligence and insights into their data. And again, I've said it many times, Tableau, when I was actually speaking to some of the Tableau representatives about this topic and what my message would be, I said to them, had I gone to any of your salespeople 2 years ago or 3 years ago and said, have I got a use case for you? They would have laughed, and I would have, they would have said, you're crazy. This is not a typical use case for Tableau. We're talking about very dense data, a lot of complexity, but I think it's an example of if you focus on that business user and what you need, and in this case we needed to really serve up something for them that is appropriately interactive, but appropriately controlled so they don't get lost. They don't need to explore the data if we've delivered it well enough for them. They need to see and interpret and interact. Explore, by explore I mean going lots of places. And Tableau has been fundamental to us for that, because it's allowed us to give them something that they can take and learn fairly quickly and make progress on. So that's it. Thank you for your time.